You know what you can do? Just get a tree that's on stage because I don't. Okay, so let's begin right now. So we're going to talk about some more single player stuff. Now, this is actually part two to a lecture that I did a few weeks ago, but for some reason, I never got to the part two, and I think this is a good time for it because your next project. Now, I know you're just, you're just finishing up the what I'm probably going to call in the future the scripted adventure or something like that, but you know them as the immersive sim. But the project you're going to do after that is the single player combat scripting level. And just to kind of introduce this, if Brantley hasn't already in your labs introduced it, let me just talk about that a little bit, what that is like. So it's going to be a little different in that we're giving you a template. It's actually a template that's from the Unreal Store that I bought and looked at, a year or two ago. And fortunately, the licensing on that, you can actually give it out to a class. It's so we're not breaking rules by doing that. If you're wondering about that. And basically, it's a really nice toolkit that will give you some single player things that you didn't have before in just stock Unreal. You're going to get like single player AIs. That's the big one. AIs that you can shoot at, because that combat scripting is the main focus of this assignment. So, okay, so the deathmatch is we're talking about like levels of openness that each of these three levels that you're making in this class kind of have. So obviously the one that you're just finishing up and that we're going to like base my research program on and all that, it's the most wide open. I mean, you could pretty much do anything you want within the the few weeks of time that you have to make it. Really, time is the only thing that's restricting you on that. It's pretty wide open. We give you advice and tips and things, but it's pretty wide open. The death match is kind of medium openness, right? Like I did really need for you to have it be a death match because I very specifically wanted you to practice those design skills, right? With this, it's similar. It's probably, at least on the surface, this new assignment that you're about to start is you have the least amount of freedom, at least on paper, right? Because really what I'm after is you doing really good or creating really good combat scripting. And what I mean by combat scripting, I mean you enter an area and enemies pop out from places and you shoot them. And I know that's like, especially I find in college, although, Purdue was less like this because Purdue is not an art school in any sense, right? It's engineering. So maybe it's a little less like this. But at least in my head, when I think of college, I think this is artistic and creative and open-ended and artsy. And actually, I really support that notion. I like kind of having it be that way because I sort of figure that in your careers, you're going to have the rest of your life to kind of, do sort of commercial game development where everything fits in a little box. But with this particular project, I am kind of constraining you to make a level where you have there's an assignment document. Brantley will introduce it soon if he hasn't already in the labs, where I just want you to make a couple of combat scenarios. You're just chaining together a couple of single player first person shooter combat scenarios, right? With these AIs that you have, right? There's, I think, all the basic ones that you'd expect, like a machine gun person, a melee person, a sniper person AI. I think all that's in the kit. And there's like every gun that you can imagine is in this thing. Like it's all done in like a white box form. Like it's basically a white box version of kind of like Borderlands. You can tell the creator had Borderlands in his head because like there's vending machines and stuff, kind of similar to Borderlands. So it kind of, there's vehicles. I kind of would dissuade you a little from using the vehicles only because what I'm really interested in exercising again is that ability to make good combats. You go into an area and the combat's well laid out, right? It's some of the things we've talked about in some of the lectures before, and we're about to talk about in this lecture in terms of spreading out the enemy so the player has to look around up and down, but keeping things in front of you, not having the player get attacked from all directions all the time, right? These sort of combat design scripting fundamentals. This assignment is about exercising that, because that's actually really important if you're going to work as some kind of level designer, especially as a level scripter, I think, in the video game industry here. Because, I mean, let's face it, right? You go to work for Ubisoft, you might work on Far Cry 17 at some point. And that's probably going to have combat scenarios, right? You work on Tomb Raider 52 or whatever it is that we're doing in the industry by the time you get into it. These are things you really need to know how to do well, and so it's really important that you exercise those skills. So yeah, when you get to this assignment, just understand its purpose, its sort of pedagogical purpose. It's really good to have something on your portfolio, again, if you're going for level design or some type of level design, game design thing, that shows that you can do this well. And so this lecture is, in the next lectures we're going to do, we're all going to try to give you theoretical information to help you with the balancing, scripting, and execution of these sort of combat-oriented single-player levels. Okay, preamble aside, let's roll here. Okay, so hopefully I can get the WebEx stuff out of my way. Okay, so how are levels or missions scripted? So there's a couple different methods that studios use when a level scripter sits down, and yes, they're sometimes called level designers, but again, we're talking about the version of level design where you're doing maybe a little bit more programming. So there's kind of the beat sheet method, right? And in this method, you're given a document that lists a bunch of narrative beats, probably in a bulleted list. It's one of the reasons why I like bulleted lists in your document so much. I'm just so used to seeing things presented that way. And so you sit down to make a level, and you have this narrative beat sheet. John Smith has to encounter zombies in the library. That could be a beat in that beat sheet, right? Now, in this method, you have a lot of freedom in how, like, it doesn't say that the zombies have to appear in the middle of the library or in the back room of the library or in the upstairs part of the library. So, there is like a lot of freedom in exactly how you implement things when you're working kind of from these kind of narrative beats, right? You have a lot of ability to kind of shift things around and still fulfill that basic bullet point, essentially. Now, the other method that you sometimes see in terms of how levels get created is what I call the prototype method. So here, and this works best as, especially in pre-production, before a game narrative is really bolted down, because what you're doing is you're sort of just freely designing, right? You're just freely making things, and you're just trying things out, right? And yeah, you're making prototypes. In fact, I have a new class that is sort of based on this. It's a little bit more game design than level design oriented. That's basically you crank out prototypes in the class is kind of the main gist, and it will be next year. It's not for this spring; it's next year. But you're all juniors, I think, so you'll be around. That'll be called, like, it's a 390s. All new courses are 390s. It'll be called like game prototyping, I think, game design prototyping, something like that. So look for that, because it is very much based on this method. And so what you do is you build this library of concepts, based on all these. Yeah. Yes, that's right. And really, that does happen there. And really, where I first learned of the prototype method, in fact, I think this was at the same GDC that I saw the Breath of the Wild presentation. I think it was. There was a Titanfall 2 single player campaign presentation, and they talked about very specifically how they first made a bunch of just kind of interesting prototypes, and then later kind of picked the best things to make the real game out of. And I think that method has a lot of value. Certainly, when I think about some of my favorite game development experiences, as a professional, it's usually involved games where I had this time to crank out these prototypes. That was definitely true on Earth Defense Force. It was somewhat true on Fire Team Elite. Although because of the fact they did kind of go to this Left 4 Dead thing later, some of those things weren't as usable as it would have been had they kind of stuck with the same concept that they had originally when I was there. But nevertheless, and I'm going to have to try to edit that part out. It's one of the reasons why I'm behind on posting these. There's a couple of things like that I need to take out of the last lectures from last week. Anyway, so that's what the prototype method is. So you build without really worrying about story, and you're trying to find cool things to use later. Okay, so there's pros and cons to each method. I think each method has a lot of value in different contexts. All right, so scripting via the beat sheet. This is kind of an example of what this might look like, right? You might get a document that has these types of bullet points on it, right? Where it's just very generic sort of story beats, and you just have to, with the tools you have, implement those, make those things happen, right? Player enters foyer. They get a telephone call. After the call is answered, door opens. After entering the next room, they are attacked by a ghost, right? And you all have enough skills now, at least I hope you do, you should, that I can give this to you now, right? And you'd be able to knock this out in Unreal. I think all of you in a few hours could do a white box version of these bullets, right? All of the scripting wouldn't be too hard. I mean, maybe you don't have the telephone call ring and you have to fake that, but other than not having assets, you would definitely be able to do this. Okay, so you have, of course, like I was saying before, a degree of freedom in how you implement these things. You could choose to lock the door ahead, preventing the player from getting to the next room while the phone call event's happening, or you can allow the player to trigger that before the phone call, right? It doesn't say this is a linear progression, but it doesn't necessarily say it has to be the phone call must happen before, right? Otherwise, this is the whole. Have any of you played that game where you're told to teach someone how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And it's an exercise of getting the instructions right, and the other person's meant to be super ridiculously literal about it. So if you're not careful, they're putting the peanut butter on the wrong side of the bread, all that. This is kind of what this kind of stuff is, right? If whomever, it would be maybe a narrative designer, or maybe maybe your lead or someone, whoever's coming up with these beat sheets, they do kind of have a responsibility to be super clear here, because I do think it's really important to allow the designers implementing these things to be creative. So if they're not saying the telephone call has to happen first, then I do believe you have the freedom to make the next event where you enter the room happen before, if the player runs past it, right? And I think you have that freedom. Okay, so these are usually vague, right? They're not full-on level design documents. They're narrative focused, and they don't exclude you doing other things, right? You may, of course, this will vary project by project, and whatever. But generally, when you're building games this way out of these types of documents, I mean, you can include other gameplay elements that's not in the beat sheet, right? The beat sheet isn't the same thing as even the documents that you make in this class, where you're trying to describe everything that's happening in the level. It really is just trying to get across what must occur here, right? These are things that have to happen, okay? Now, sometimes the scripters themselves write this, right? It's not always by a lead or narrative designer, but that depends. Okay, so games I've worked on that have used this method, and no surprise here, story-heavy games tend to do this, right? These are two story-heavy games I've worked on. Lost Within, of course, that's a survival horror thing we did for Amazon. And everyone knows what BioShock Infinite is. So, games that have a lot of story, you're generally going to see this sort of thing. Now, some pros and cons of this method. It is easy to pre-plan levels because, you create this series of high-level beats. It's not particularly detailed, right? So it's kind of easy to make these lists. You can get some degree of prediction in terms of scripting complexity based on the beat sheet itself. Obviously, the little sample one I showed you, there's nothing in that that's particularly complex. And the task, you're kind of simplifying what the scripter has to do. I think it's a nice method in that you just get a document and you just kind of get down to work, right? You're sort of unlike the prototype method where there's this process of ideation and you're sitting down and you're trying to crank out new and innovative things. With this process, you're like, nope, I just got to make these story beats happen, right? It kind of cuts through the muck a bit. And I'll say, even on senior capstones, I've seen this happen where, once they get to the point where they have the game built up enough to make the rest of the game, it really does just become a series of make sure this beat happens, this beat happens. And it does become a thing where you can kind of just put your head down and dig. Okay, so disadvantages of this method. It can lead to boring levels, right? Because if you're just sitting down and just making the beats without thinking about trying to really push the gameplay, which can happen because you're just trying to put those beats in, right? Answer the phone, go to the room, get attacked by ghosts. You're focusing on not necessarily gameplay but story elements, and that can lead to a lot of sameness. Now, it can happen, of course, that a beat sheet can go wild and include things in them that are difficult to do with your given tools. That can happen as well, but that's pretty rare, I think. Usually, these story beats are pretty pretty simple, pretty mundane. Usually, again, just in my experience. Okay, so scripting via the prototyping method, scripting levels, I should say. So here, like I said before, we're experimenting by making interesting gameplay scenarios. So you start not by making anything that you think is going to ship, right? I mean, you're just making kind of fun one-off experiments. All right, you're never going to ship these, right? This is never going to be the real game, right? These are just demonstrations of things that you think are going to be cool. And what you're doing is you're trying to create a library of sort of these functional prototypes you can draw from later. Now, some examples of why you might do this, right? You may introduce a new game mechanic that doesn't already exist in the game, right? And this feels old school. This still happens, right? But these days, it's like games are so ruthlessly systemic, right? Where it's like, okay, you're going to have your telekinesis power, you're going to have your time freeze power, you're going to have maybe one or two other powers, and then the whole game, hundreds of hours, are going to be how we put these 3 or 4 powers together in the environment, right? That's kind of games more and more like this. They're really systems driven. Versus when I play PS2 games, it's like, okay, if I'm playing an old Lord of the Rings game on PS2, it's like, okay, you have your basic melee attacks with the sword, and that's our game system. That's the systemic part. That's going to get boring. So we really need the level designer to come up with novel things to happen, that are specific to that level, right? And that's almost become, for a long time, that was just like the standard way that you tried to get gameplay variety, right? You would have the escort mission level, which everyone hates. Everyone say they hate, but you see it all over the place. You have your, again, I'm saying this because I'm playing the Two Towers PS2 game. I find some of the old licensed games are actually really fun to play in 2021 because they're just so different. How games are made today, it's like, yeah, they made a really cool set of combat moves, but it gets old quickly. So you can tell they experimented to try to find interesting ways to draw out the variety. And one of the things is citizens are getting, civilians, peasants are getting attacked in some Rohan village, and you have to make sure a certain amount of them don't die, right? That's a one-off thing. Doesn't happen again in the game, right? These probably come from prototypes, from like things that level designers, level scripters have knocked together to demonstrate. And you still see it sometimes. Titanfall 2, again, people often point to that as like a relatively modern game that has like a really awesome kind of old school single player. That's how they build it. And so what's, of course, really cool about this is you get some really interesting things, some really unique things happening when you do it this way. And games that I've worked on that have done this, Insect Armageddon. Now, I say Lost Within, even though it used the beat sheet method. Yes, games can do this, can do both of these things, right? There was definitely a time in Lost Within where we were working on just experiments, right? And then once you wrap that up, you go into production, then you start going into that beat sheet mode. You just have to get the game content built. So definitely both can happen. I suppose it's possible on Bioshock it happened, but I was not on the project then, so I would have no idea. I assumed something like that was happening on that. Now, I'm talking about the immersive sims here, which you're about done with. But in terms of just your future work, obviously, I think the beat sheets are really beneficial for students because it keeps you focused on getting your content built. But I do think that this notion of kind of sitting down, maybe this is something. Yes, your combat scripting assignments are hyper focused on a certain thing, but that doesn't mean that you can't experiment, with ideas that you might bring into that project. It's still open enough that you could have that, right? So keep that in mind. Just sit down sometime, try to make some cool things happen, right? Try to experiment with things, build an internal library, if you will, of cool stuff that you might be able to employ in future projects. No one's stopping you from doing that. You take one of my classes next year, even for capstone, even for other things you're doing. There's no reason why some one-off prototype can't provide good input for that. Okay, so what we've talked about so far is just sort of really high-level stuff. Kind of, this is what the industry does. And it's not necessarily super applicable to what you're about to be doing. It is a little bit, but it isn't, directly, right? You have to abstract it a little bit. Here is something I think is definitely directly applicable to what you're about to do, and really anytime you're making any action game level at all, right? And that's really the art of pacing. Pacing's really important. One of the most important things, actually, when doing action. So the challenge is this, right? If you step on the gas all the way, right? If you've ever played a game, arcade games are like this because they're trying to kill you every couple of minutes. If you play a game where it's just constant action, you're fully engaged, right? For the time you're playing, all your senses, you're just bent on survival, but you get tired really quickly, right? You get like sort of exhausted, and you're like, I can't keep doing this, right? That's so you're fully engaged, but you're exhausted. If you don't engage them enough, then they'll get bored for that reason. So there's sort of a nice balance, right? Don't engage enough, they'll get bored. Engage too much, they'll get tired. So what you have to do is find that balance, and the intensity curve is a way I like to abstract what that balance is. Okay, so we'll talk about high intensity games. Games that, of course, are real high intensity. They have like a one more time feeling to them that often help you like wash, rinse, repeat. But here's a intensity curve example. All right, this is something I did. I can't remember if this was for a design test or if I did this for this lecture anymore, or whatever it was, but I did do it. It was me. And we've shown you one of these before. So this isn't the first time you've seen one of these, this idea of an intensity curve, because you saw it with the Resident Evil lecture. So what we're trying to do here, again, if you don't remember that from that discussion, the intensity curve is purely an abstract thing, right? It's not scientific, like this 0 to 100 intensity scale and where these things are. Yes, I did do this in Excel. It's not like it's my subjective opinion of what is an 80, right? I'm really just going by my personal experience. So that caveat aside, it's still enough to reveal some trends, right? If you played this level, Tomb Raider, the reboot Tomb Raider, not the original PS1 Tomb Raider. So this is the first Square Enix, rebooted modern Tomb Raider is where this comes from. You might decide that, if you did this, that this is a 70, or maybe you decide it's a 90, but I bet that you still have a peak here of some sort, right? I think we could feel reasonably confident that we would all have similar peaks, even if you judge the intensities a little differently. And so you can kind of see kind of how this works as you go through the level, where you have peaks and valleys, but it's not staying up high for long stretches of time, right? The bottom axis is time. The left axis is intensity here. So you see that it's pretty equal, right? The spikes are fairly equal amounts of time, and there's lots and lots of valleys, but they don't last too long. And I like this because this is kind of a classic intensity curve. They don't always have to be this way, of course, but this is what they often are. Where you notice the highest intensity isn't at the very end; it's almost to the end, right? This is so common. You hit them with the most intense stuff about 2/3 of the way, and then you kind of give them a rest period. So this is a very, very typical sort of intensity curve for an action game. All right, so you could simply explore and do low intensity tasks in games, but high intensity tasks are available when desired. Open world games are really good at this, so that's one way this can be balanced, right? Is you're kind of constantly drip feeding kind of low engagement things, but there's other things there, available for you to do if you want. Okay, so a great intensity curve shows a contrast, right? Now, 2D level design gem, that's another lecture you're going to get that you haven't gotten yet, and so don't just ignore that bullet point. So encounters are almost always followed by rest. We can see this pretty clearly here. And note how these rests are brief but often, right? Often just ramping it down. And again, if this were an arcade game, you wouldn't have all these, right? Because again, we're trying to get your quarters out of your pocket. But this is a home console game or a game you play on PC or whatever. So it's just a different model of engagement that we're going for here. Now, good games figure out what intensity curves work best because it's always going to be different, right? And I'll use Aliens again as an example of this. Like, this style doesn't quite work, I think, for a Left 4 Dead style game because it's a different pacing, right? I think you need actually bigger valleys but way longer peaks, I think, in a Left 4 Dead style thing where you're like, yes, there's always the sort of low level encounter manager zombies in Left 4 Dead, right? There's always a few around, but there's kind of these, there's the safe rooms where like the time where it's going to be a big peak that lasts a while you're reloading, but then there's the big pitched encounters that last a long time, right? So different types of games are going to have different sort of intensity curves that work for them. And that's part of finding the fun when you're developing an action game is figuring out the intensity that works best. This reminds me of a famous quote from the Halo developers, Bungie, now 343 or whatever, where they said something like, what we did is we found 30 seconds fun and repeated it for, 10 hours, talking about the Halo single player campaign. And that's kind of what all action games are, right? You're doing one kind of stable activity over and over again, and you have to use all these tricks to make that actually entertaining for a long period of time. Okay, let's talk about guiding the player. Okay, so a common task, and this is something we've been harping on a lot, is making sure the player knows what the heck they're doing, right? Of critical importance. And hopefully, as you test each other's projects for our research, hopefully you've all done a good job on your immersive sims and making sure the player knows what the heck they're doing. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, right? And a scripter is often in charge of doing those things. Sometimes some of these things are automated, but often it is you as the level scripter going in and turning on and off waypoints. Often that's something you're doing, right? Other guidance systems, right? If those aren't automated. Giving prompts and reminders about key tasks, very common level scripter thing to do. Forcing players to gather in a particular place before proceeding. This is a big co-op gameplay thing. Like sometimes you need to orchestrate times where the crew's together, they're in one room, right? So you have to orchestrate that somehow with the systems that you have. Usually, most games have a trigger that will only fire when all the players are in it. That's a pretty common way of doing that. Kind of a gathering trigger, if you will. It's not too hard to make that happen in Unreal, just a little bit of scripting. Gating areas by obstructing the player from progress. So making sure that they can't get to areas that they shouldn't get to, or that areas that would be confusing to them if they got to, right? Like making sure that you're only allowing them to be in the areas where they're supposed to be. Now, of course, you have a tremendous amount of choice in how you try to direct players through an experience. How much hand holding is good, just from a high level design perspective, okay? Now, I say entirely up to you, but I'm really, especially because of the fact that I have this research program, and part of it is that, student projects being fun. How can I help them be fun? Obviously, I think the research would go best if everyone just had an amazing time playing each other's stuff, and I got all this amazing data, and then all of my work is figuring out why everything was so much fun. So that's why I've been like, sort of harping on these things a little bit more than this slide that I wrote before I launched this research program implies. This is going to contradict a little bit of what I'm saying. A good game always makes sure the player knows what to do. Yes, that's true. A great game does this with as little text prompting as possible. Yes, I still believe that. I just, in terms of your levels, one of the reasons I would give, Brantley and I have been giving the advice we've been giving, is that part of how a great game does that, okay, is with finished art, which you're not going to have. It does that with a lot of things that you're not going to have in a 3-week, white box. That's why I've been saying, yeah, use text prompts, make sure the player knows what they're doing. But yeah, sure, a great game can use as little text as possible in letting you know what to do. Okay, that's it for now. I will see you all later.
See you all later.